Hey everybody, welcome back to Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Noah, and I'm so happy that you've joined me for another installment of the show. This week, we are getting back to the history of the UFT. This will be part 4 of our series on the history of the UFT, so if you are new to the show, it might be worth going back to check out episodes 8, 10, and 14, which are parts 1 through 3 of this series, respectively. It's been a little while, but we left off in 1989, at the end of a decade ravaged by a growing anti-union movement that continues in the U.S. to this day. The strongest evidence of this trend, at the local level at least, is probably the appointment of an anti-union labor lawyer to the position of First Deputy Chancellor in the NYC DOE a little over a week ago. For anybody who has been following the show recently, you'll know, of course, that I'm talking about Dan Weisberg, who was named First Deputy Chancellor just a week after we covered him as an E4E board member. E4E, of course, being a Walton Family Foundation-funded AstroTurf group attempting to disempower teachers by undermining their union. For more on Dan Weisberg, check out that episode, number 19, as well as episode 20 from the week after. Anyway, our union's response to this very trend, this trend of increasing anti-union sentiment, is the story of how we have arrived at our current moment. The Chicago Teachers Union, which is objectively a weaker union than the UFT in terms of member numbers and financial capacity, nonetheless successfully voted for remote-only instruction this past week. Meanwhile, the UFT is organizing no such vote and making no such demand of the NYC DOE, though it is abundantly clear that its membership would vote along similar lines as the CTU, since remote or hybrid would be the safest and most effective means of conducting school in the current circumstances. Now, before anybody gets too cranky and starts writing in, I am not referring to long-term remote or hybrid necessarily, but rather to a short-term return to remote or hybrid so as to drive down the infection rate in schools, which as of right now is pretty high. So that, in essence, is one justification for studying the history of the union. We are told repeatedly that we have a very strong union, and the numbers bear that out to some extent, as New York is really one of very few places in the country where teachers make enough money and enjoy sufficient benefits to dispense with second jobs. However, other unions, like the Chicago Teachers Union, for example, seem to be more effective at keeping their teachers safe. I would like to know, and I suspect a lot of us might like to know, how we reached this point where members of the most powerful teachers union in the country are maybe thinking about looking up jobs in Chicago. I don't think the complete answer is to be found in the 90s, but this decade is certainly part of the overall trend. A few key details unfold in this decade in the story of how a militant labor union ready to strike at the drop of a hat would eventually get so cozy with management that repeated failures on the part of management to uphold their end of health and safety agreements in the middle of a global pandemic would be met with silence rather than a strike. The year is 1990. Joseph Fernandez has been named chancellor after serving as chancellor in the Miami-Dade School District. His primary focus is on school-based management, which he has successfully implemented at his last job in Florida. Much like our new chancellor, David Banks, He starts talking before he has even taken office about cutting jobs at Central in order to free up more funding for schools. In the case of Fernandez, the figures are 200 jobs and $15 million. Later that year, in October, Mayor Dinkins, the Board of Education, and the UFT come to an agreement on a pretty favorable contract. It includes a 5.5% raise and over 100 improvements in working conditions, many of which remain important to us as teachers today. For example, that 1990 contract made it impossible for a principal to change a student's grade without giving the teacher a written explanation. It also forbade principals from dictating the format of a lesson plan or collecting lesson plans routinely. It made it easier for teachers to transfer between schools and set the stage for arbitration by a single arbitrator in cases related to the disciplining or dismissal of teachers, which helped to speed up the hearing process. 1990 was also the year that the Board of Examiners was finally dispensed with. By 1990, that office had become redundant in addition to dysfunctional. Not only was it running way behind schedule in certifying teachers who would have to work under temporary licenses in the interim, sometimes years, between getting hired and completing their board exams, there was also a state board fulfilling the same purpose, meaning teachers in the city were forced to take 2 sets of tests. Fernandez and the UFT worked together to get rid of the board examiners, as it was in their mutual best interest. The 1990 contract seemed a little too good to be true, and in early 1991, it proved to be so, as the city found itself in yet another fiscal crisis and the state cut funding halfway through the school year. It looked like 3,500 teachers might get laid off by the end of the year. In a deal that staved off the layoffs, the UFT renegotiated the contract, with members voting to defer up to 1.5% of their paychecks until the 95 to 96 school year. There would be 2 payments, one in 95 and one in 96, with 9% interest kicking in at the beginning of that 95 to 96 school year. This would allow the UFT to spot the city about $40 million. In return, the city agreed to bar the laying off of any UFT member, so nobody would be laid off. A couple of other facets to this deal that were meant to sort of sweeten the pot have remained in effect to shape our working conditions to this day. They include the abolition of tipping, which was a process whereby DOE teachers would be excessed mid-year after the predictable mid-year drop in student enrollment, as well as the origin of midwinter recess, which for us this year will be February 21st through 25th. Between July 1991 and January 1992, Mayor Dinkins had cut about $470 million from the city education budget, which Chancellor Fernandez then had to pass on to schools. The latter asked the UFT for help in finding the fat to trim, but Sandra Feldman, then president of the UFT, said, and I quote, "I've directed all UFT district representatives not to cooperate with efforts to identify any further school-based services to be eliminated. They also will refuse to sign off on any plans that include further loss of classroom support services to children." Dinkins was looking to cut another $67 million from the education budget in 1993. The union increased pressure in response to both the budget cuts and a stalled contract negotiation. It launched a TV ad campaign against the incumbent in March and April. By August of 1993, the contract negotiation looked finally to be complete, with a 9% average raise dispersed over 4 years, 2 of which having already passed, of course, since the contract had lapsed in 1992. The raise wouldn't be paid out for another 18 months, since the city was still mired in a financial crisis. A lot of the raise money was also weighted at the highest salary steps in order to make the city more competitive with neighboring districts. So this was really not a victory for rank-and-file, early career teachers. The delegate assembly eventually split the vote on an endorsement in the mayoral election, leaving both Dinkins and his challenger Rudy Giuliani without the UFT endorsement. Giuliani won, of course, and there will be much more to say about him later. For now, though, it is important that we take a look at a moment in 1993 with really obvious parallels to the present day. In fall 1993, schools did not open on time as scheduled after a school construction authority work crew discovered asbestos in a building that had been officially declared asbestos-free. Through the work of two independent investigators, Toby Thatcher and Edward Stanchik, it came to light that the Board of Education's asbestos task force had fabricated a third of the federally mandated asbestos safety reports. Mayor Dinkins made the right call and required inspections of 1,069 school buildings and 107 leased sites in the public school system. Shortly thereafter, the city dismissed most of its new inspectors because they had been trained by the consultant accused of fabrication. One contractor was suspended for not revealing scores of environmental violations and fines on prior asbestos jobs. And then the board learned that many of the scorecards, which were supposed to show where damaged asbestos was in each building, were complete fabrications as well. Inspectors had to start from scratch. Here's an excerpt of an article in the New York Times from that time period by Stephen Lee Myers entitled, "School Asbestos More Extensive Than Expected." The emergency inspection of the New York City public school system has found at least some exposed asbestos in every school checked so far, indicating the scandal over the school testing program is more severe and costly than officials initially expected. Inspectors scouring the city's 1,069 public schools have received results from 25 schools showing asbestos contamination in each one, while officials have also determined that 69 other schools already undergoing renovations also have asbestos hazards, for a total of 94, officials heading the inspection said yesterday. In one case, at Public School 133 in Park Slope, Brooklyn, the asbestos was so extensive that officials announced that the task of removing it would take at least 10 weeks, meaning classes could not begin there until October, a month after school starts on September 9th. The school, built at the turn of the 20th century, is the city's first to be closed because of contamination since officials announced that asbestos reports for all of the city's schools had been so mismanaged and possibly fraudulent as to be meaningless. In many of the other cases, the amount of exposed asbestos is small, and officials said yesterday that they would be able to have the schools cleaned up in time for classes to begin. At 3 schools, Public Schools 11 and 13 on Staten Island, and Public School 68 in Queens, the repairs have already been completed and the schools declared asbestos-free. Until yesterday, officials heading the cleanup, which now involves more than 40 teams of inspectors, had announced that asbestos had been found in only a handful of schools. That is because they announced the findings only after they had decided how to clean up the asbestos in each school. When asked yesterday to say specifically how many schools so far had been determined to have exposed asbestos, however, they acknowledged that the total was 94. Asbestos, which was used as a fire-retardant insulation in schools for decades, does not pose an immediate health threat as long as it remains sealed and undamaged, behind plaster, for example. But when it becomes exposed, it can fray into microscopic fibers that are dangerous if inhaled over time. In each of the schools, the asbestos found has been damaged or exposed, but neither officials heading the cleanup nor officials at City Hall would comment on whether children or teachers had been exposed. "We're not going to get into that because we don't know," said Meyer Asfrucher, a trustee of the School Construction Authority, the independent agency that builds and renovates the city's schools. Still, he said, the exposed asbestos could have been there for multiple years. Officials said that despite the findings of asbestos, other tests to measure the amount in the air showed levels below those considered by the federal government to be dangerous. Bernard P. Orlin, the Construction Authority's Director of Industrial and Environmental Hygiene, said, "It's some of the best news we've had in a long time." He and other officials, however, cautioned that those tests were not conclusive and had only been run at a handful of schools. The preliminary results of the tests, which inspectors conducted first at schools expected to have the greatest threat of asbestos, indicated a more serious problem than officials anticipated when two independent investigators announced on August 6th that the reports were inaccurate. Feldman and her legal counsel, Randi Weingarten, who would go on to become president of the UFT and currently serves as the president of the AFT, sued the city in 1994 to compel it to enforce its building code and the city charter, which required the buildings department to inspect schools, investigate complaints, and enforce the code. At the same time, Giuliani had just been sworn in and made it clear that funding for rating agencies and other bodies of the municipal workforce would be going down, not up. To compare this situation with the one we're facing in the present day is pretty easy. We're talking about health consequences arising from material circumstances in schools. In the 90s, the buildings were falling apart, exposing asbestos built into the building, but over time breaking down and becoming hazardous. Now we're talking about overcrowded buildings with ancient ventilation systems spreading COVID rapidly among students, teachers, and administrators. The response could not be any more diametrically opposed, though. As soon as the severity of the threat became clear in the 90s, the mayor and the city were prepared to close some buildings for over a month, if need be, to ensure the safety of the children. The UFT announced early on that it would not let members enter any building that had not been certified safe. The findings of the UFT's Health and Safety Committee became the only ones that members and parents trusted. If the UFT hadn't cleared a school, students wouldn't go in. Back then, there was no remote option either, but the health and safety of the children nonetheless came first. It cannot be overstated how different these two scenarios are. So many of the teachers with whom I've spoken agree with my feeling that we've been abandoned by the leadership of our union. The severity of the threat is apparent in numbers that are publicly available, yet the mayor is hell-bent on keeping schools open and in person at the cost of whatever harm might be mitigated through a temporary period of remote learning. That said, I wonder if we might only be about halfway through the story. Like, maybe there's still time for the other shoe to drop in the COVID debacle the way it did in the asbestos debacle. Here's what I mean, in the form of an excerpt from an article entitled "School Officials Sent to Prison Over False Asbestos Reports," written by Seth Faison in 1994. The former head of the asbestos task force for New York City schools was sentenced yesterday to 2.5 years in prison for falsely reporting that the schools were free of contamination. The later discovery of asbestos set off a crisis that delayed the opening of school for almost 1 million children last year. The official, Robert Pardee, the first Board of Education official to be convicted in the asbestos scandal that emerged last summer, admitted certifying reports that inspections had been finished on hundreds of schools where federally mandated checks and laboratory tests had not been completed. At one sitting in May 1989, Mr. Pardee admitted he signed more than 100 blank inspection forms as his staff watched. Yesterday, he cried softly as he stood before Judge Robert L. Carter in Federal District Court in Manhattan. "I recognize that you are not a thief," said Judge Carter, moments before delivering the sentence. "You're not really a criminal. The problem with this case, however, is that the way you acted created an enormous danger to school children and teachers and so forth." I'll cut in there for a second. What an absurd thing to say as a judge, to look at someone who has falsified documents in order to willfully expose children and, teachers, whatever, to asbestos, which has long-term health effects, and say you're not one of the criminals I think of as a criminal. You're just you're a guy caught in a tough situation, and the way that you acted, it's just absurd. I'll continue reading the article now. Mr. Party, a 52-year-old architect, said he erred only in his zeal to meet a federal deadline in May 1989 to certify that the city's 1,110 schools were free of contamination. Mr. Party pleaded guilty in March to conspiracy and falsifying documents, and admitted that he also hoped to win a promotion and a raise by meeting the deadline. "I never took money from a contractor," he told Judge Carter. "I'm a guy who could not admit failure in meeting a deadline." Now, do I think anybody is going to jail over what happened in the Situation Room in mid-December? No, probably not. Our chancellor's brother allegedly definitely took part in a bribery scandal, resigned, got off scot-free, and is now a deputy mayor, along with David Banks' wife, who allegedly avoided assault charges more than once thanks to her social connections. But who knows what the future might hold in a post-COVID, maybe even post-capitalist society in which we can fully recognize the value of human life and the need for consequences when those in power ignore the value of human life in order to ensure the gears of extractive profit grind on, leaving broken people, parents, children, and the teachers charged with teaching and protecting them externalized and scattered amongst the refuse. George Pataki took office as governor in New York on January 1st, 1995. Here he is laying out his basic premise in his inaugural address.
"The facts are these. Spending is too high. The regulatory burden on our people excessive. Our tax burden too heavy. Let me repeat what the people of this state already know. State government is too big and it spends too much money. It's simple. It's time for a change." Let us then cut government spending and cut it again, remembering always that by downsizing government, we can restore people's confidence in the future by expanding individual responsibility and individual freedom. This is the challenge of the 90s, the challenge we face as we prepare to enter the next century, to preserve and protect personal freedom and to restore individual responsibility. And as we confront our state's fiscal crisis, let us remember a simple truth. More government means higher taxes and fewer jobs. Less government means lower taxes and more jobs.
Here he is a year later, sharing his beliefs on education in the State of the State address.
Just as teachers want to teach, most students want to learn. In order to create a safe and secure learning environment for both teachers and students, I will propose giving real authority to teachers to remove disruptive students from the classroom.
Pataki forecast a $4 billion shortfall for the next fiscal year, but also demanded $1 billion in tax cuts, thus necessitating $5 billion less spending in order to close the deficit, particularly in Medicaid and welfare. Pataki won a 2-year tax cut, which meant $271 million less in state aid to New York City in 1996. Mayor Giuliani set out to add that amount to a previously announced $400 million reduction in services, ranging from schools to libraries to daycare centers. It fit really nicely with what Giuliani wanted to do anyway. He had promised smaller government and no tax increases, which meant 7,000 fewer city workers by September 1994 and another 9,000 fewer in the year to follow. Pataki and Giuliani, both having sipped the Reagan austerity Kool-Aid, worked together to hand down the largest cuts in public spending in New York since the Great Depression. Programming was cut left and right, as was the city payroll, for really no good reason other than to establish the tax structure that essentially prevails to this day, in which taxes are really for the working class, whereas the wealthiest New Yorkers pay next to nothing proportionally. The rest of the country was in the middle of a decade-long economic boom, yet New York City's public sphere was in as bad a shape as it was during the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. It was basically made up. The money was there, yet Feldman, of the UFT, and other municipal unions negotiated as if this neoliberal fantasy were the real deal. They accepted $440 million in cuts or deferrals of city contributions to healthcare, welfare benefits, and pension funds, with $160 million more in cuts to come from work rule changes. In keeping with this new approach to negotiating with the worst elements of the neoliberal assault on working people, the UFT reached a contract deal with a reasonably hefty 13% raise and a written agreement barring layoffs through 1998, but starting pay would be reduced, with 5% withheld until a teacher's fifth year of teaching, at which point it would be paid out as a cash bonus. For the first time in its history, the rank and file of the union voted to send a contract proposed by the leadership back to negotiation. While all of this was happening, Giuliani and 62 other public officials had put through a 28% increase in their own salaries. In the end, the contract went through with the elimination of the 5% penalty on early career teachers. It paid for itself basically with a 2-month extension to the contractual term. Sandra Feldman resigned as president of the UFT in January 1998 in order to focus more on her role as president of the AFT. Randy Weingarten, her legal counsel who had gotten her teaching license and taught social studies while working for the union, stepped up as president. Over the next few years, the back and forth with Giuliani largely concerned publicly funded private and charter schools. By 1999, Giuliani's budget address called for publicly financed vouchers, a $12 million plan to send 3,000 children to parochial and private schools. Weingarten wrote that the fight was critical both because a common public school system is the bedrock of an egalitarian democracy, and because if vouchers enable government and taxpayers to shrug off the need to invest in public schools, we will never convince them that well-prepared teachers and well-financed public schools are worth investing in too. In the end, the plan didn't really work out to anybody's liking, as most of the kids who made use of the vouchers were already in private or parochial schools, but the public schools were nonetheless damaged reputationally in the midst of a massive public conversation about how to save kids from public school. The fight for public education rages on, with charters capped in New York, but who knows for how long. Stay tuned for future episodes diving into charter schools in the city and what they mean for students, families, and unionized teachers in a public school system. As this fourth installment in our series on the history of the UFT draws to a close, I want to thank you once again for listening. If you are enjoying what you're hearing, be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you do your podcast listening. Consider also checking out the premium episodes on Patreon at patreon.com/professional development. For $3 a month, you'll get 2 extra episodes and other goodies to be announced. For example, the next 5 subscribers to the Patreon will get limited edition professional development branded mugs as a thank you for your support for the show. They're the same mugs that go out to guests of the show. So become one of the few, the proud, the holders of a professional development mug. One other thing. If you have any feedback for us, whether it be a glowing review or some constructive criticism, please do not hesitate to reach out at professionaldevelopmentpodcast@gmail.com. It's always so nice to hear from people. Thanks again, and see you next week.